David Fincher's The Killer on Netflix was my second favorite film of 2023. I love the premise of the film, and the subtleties found in the character development are fantastic. Plus, the ending is spectacular. What was The Killer about, and what did you miss? In today's video, I'll explain The Killer. My name is Jay Sherer, and I'm a screenwriter and director who loves great stories. By the end of this video, I'll try to lay out the premise, the basic structure, and the character development that we find in The Killer. So you can watch The Killer on Netflix. It was directed by David Fincher, who has directed beloved films like Seven, Fight Club, and The Social Network. He definitely has a certain type of aesthetic, so if you don't like that aesthetic, The Killer may not be right for you, but for those of us who really like what he's digging deeper into, we really appreciate the takes that he has on certain social issues. The Killer stars Michael Fassbender as the Killer, and it was written by Andrew Kevin Walker. Now, we'll start out by just kind of breaking down the setup of the film. Now, just keep in mind that I'm going to dig pretty deep into this character because there's a lot to unpack in the setup of the film, which is basically like Act 1. So the video will move faster once we get past this first act, but this first act is very revealing to us, and a lot of the details here about the character matter in terms of understanding the plot. There's a lot to unpack here in Act 1. Act 1 begins in Paris, and it's focused on the target. Now, I should note up front here that the film divides itself into 6 chapters plus an epilogue. And if you kind of roughly look at it, Chapter 1 is essentially Act 1, which I'll talk about more here. 2, 3, 4, and 5 are essentially Act 2. Chapter 6 is Act 3, and then there's an epilogue that also exists as a, kind of add-on to Act 3. It's a really interesting structure. I kind of liked it, and it gave us some grounding for how the story was moving, so that was kind of cool too. Chapter 1 does begin in Paris, and it is called The Target. Chapter 1 is all about unveiling to us the worldview, perspective, and procedures that the killer goes through on a daily basis. Act 1 is all about unpacking what this character is like. We are in an abandoned WeWork facility, and across the street from the WeWork facility is essentially like, it's either a really ritzy apartment complex or a hotel. I think it's actually a hotel. But the killer, Michael Fassbender's character, is in the WeWork facility and has a clear view across the street into this hotel. And he's waiting for the target to show up. And then what's revealed to us is, as he basically goes about several days, spending time just in this room, waiting for his target to arrive, he is narrating to us a lot about the way that he thinks, a lot about the way that he interprets the world, and his essential worldview. And this is where Act 1 really spends most of its time, is unpacking the character of the killer. We might almost spend as much time in unpacking what's happening in Act 1 as Act 1 takes on screen. Hopefully not that long, but bear with me on this. The one thing I found really interesting and unique about this film was that narration or voiceover in film, it's not always something that should be done. Oftentimes, it's something that actually detracts from the visual approach to filmmaking. Since film is such a visual medium, a lot of times if we're telling and not showing, it can be easy to take the audience out of it, and it's sometimes considered very distracting. What's so fascinating about The Killer is that the film doesn't work, in my opinion, without the narration. It's such an in-depth character study of the killer that we need that narration to really understand what it is about this guy and how his worldview is shifting and changing throughout his character development in this film. So this is really important, but it's very unusual, and yet it's so effective. And so shout out to David Fincher and the writer of this film for really being able to capture that so well and not make it a distraction, but actually make it really interesting to us. And like I said, it's essential that we pay attention to the narration because the plot of this film is as important as the character development is. They're so intertwined together that we need to understand this character to understand why the story matters at all. Now, there's a couple things about the killer that he tells us that we probably should pay some attention to. He tells us that he's been all over the world. He's well-traveled and secular. he quotes a cartoon to describe himself and says it with gravitas. Popeye the Sailor said it best, "I am what I am." He brings up concepts like luck, karma, justice, and then he tells us that those concepts don't really exist. So we're really getting a picture into his worldview. He goes on to give us a philosophical perspective to consider. And this I found really interesting because what he says to us is that his philosophy on life is do what thou wilt will be the whole of the law. And he doesn't attribute that quote to anybody, but he abides by that approach. So it's interesting that he doesn't attribute the quote to anyone, and yet he lives his life that way. Now, I looked up this quote. This quote comes from a book that was written by Aleister Crowley. Now, for those who may know a little bit more about Aleister Crowley, and I'm by no means an expert, I don't know that much about him at all, but he is very much an occult figure. He's very much into the occult, and so for the killer to adopt this particular worldview showcases that he's a nihilist. And we're going to get into that. What does it mean to be a nihilist, and why is he one? We're going to get into that in just a minute. Doubling down on his worldview, he goes into this whole spiel about how people are born and die every day. And then he takes that kind of thing that's happening globally and then attributes it to his own work. And he says, nothing I've ever done will make a dent in these metrics, meaning the people living and dying. Now, by this time, we already know that he's an assassin, right? We saw him getting set up in the room in WeWork across the street from this hotel. Now we can be assured that he is an assassin and that he has this very nihilistic worldview. He also talks about a spiritual perspective and says, most refuse to believe that the great beyond is nothing more than a cold, infinite void, but I accept it along with the freedom that comes with acknowledging that truth. So he does not have any spiritual perspectives at all. He's very much a nihilist. Things just happen, and he just rides the wave of whatever's happening because nothing really matters, is what I would describe his worldview as being. One thing I find interesting about the setup of this film is that the killer is telling us a lot about what his philosophical perspectives on life are. But one of the things that he's not doing is he's not really telling us how he feels about these things. And I find that kind of interesting. He's very much thinking through things, but not feeling through them. And that's going to matter later on in the story. Now, I mentioned this already, but in my opinion, the killer has very clearly painted a picture of himself as a nihilist. Nothing matters. Values don't matter. Spirituality is foolish. The only thing waiting for us when we die is nothing. Therefore, do whatever you want. The Aleister Crowley quote, right? Like, make whatever laws you want to, because whatever you want to do is what you should do. Make your own path, your own laws. The very concept of morality is essentially a false doctrine, and no morality exists. Things are just what they are. And then, of course, his attribution of that is from Popeye when he says, I am what I am in this world. And that's an assassin, and it is what it is. So you should just deal with it. And then his approach to living out that worldview is one that is very dialed in and specific. He has not only a code that he abides by, but he actually has a mantra that he recites that we're going to talk a lot about because that mantra matters to the story as well. So when you look at him and what he's trying to do, he's trying to achieve success. What is success? Earning money via killing people because he's an assassin. And in order to achieve that success, he has a code and a mantra. The code is he's going to prepare. He's going to have a ton of discipline. He's going to create redundancies that he does again and again and again so he doesn't slip up. And then he must keep calm and keep moving and also not draw any attention to himself. So he's really living into this role as, this is my job, I do this job, and in order to do this job, which fits with my worldview, because it's totally acceptable under my worldview, I must be good at these things. And a lot of that to me, and I think we'll start to explore this later on as we go through this, a lot of that to me is he starts to create an emotionless sort of robotic presence that he brings into the world so that he can accomplish all the things that he wants to accomplish. I do think he asks a really, really good question that a nihilist would ask, but I think this question is good for anybody to consider. He says, of those who like to put their faith in mankind's inherent goodness, I have to ask, based on what exactly? So that's a very basic question about the nature of the universe and the nature of the world that we live in. Are human beings, is mankind inherently good, or are we inherently evil, or are good and evil concepts that really are are things that we put into the world that don't actually exist? Is it more of just a survival of the fittest type of mentality? Now, from a plot perspective, all of this is stuff that we're hearing from him in his narration. It's as if we're sitting in the room with him and we're just talking as we wait for the target to show up across the street. And while this is all unraveling and happening before us, he gets a call from Hodges. And essentially, Hodges is going to end up being his handler. It's the person who gives him contracts to carry out. And he's basically like, Hodges, this guy hasn't shown up yet. And Hodges is like, don't worry, the guy's going to show up. So the plot will move forward. Let's just take ourselves out of the story for a moment to say that David Fincher sets all of this up really beautifully. There's a guy sitting in a room for most of Act 1, and yet it's very compelling. It's very tense. It's very unsettling. The cadence that Michael Fassbender builds into this role is such that we're kind of there for the ride, and it's really interesting to hear his perspectives and to see where he's coming from. And that is really, really, really good filmmaking and really good writing as well. So I really appreciate that. Finally, after we've been sitting in this room for a pretty long period of time waiting for the target to arrive, the target does arrive. Now, we don't get a lot of information about the target. The target is kept mostly ambiguous to us. Why is that? Because this entire story we're going to see through the eyes of the killer. We're not meant to see how other people are thinking, how other people are feeling, what's going on in their lives. We're really supposed to experience everything that the killer is experiencing and almost deal with the world as he's dealing with it around him. Now, the target does have bodyguards, and he does hire a prostitute and does appear to be very rich. It's about all we know about him. And the killer waits very patiently for a clean shot to materialize. He controls his heart rate. I found this very interesting. He's listening to a Smiths song, and this is a guy who basically has described himself as a nihilist and that nothing really matters. And yet the song playing in his headphones, the line from the song, from the Smiths song, says, "I am human and I need to be loved." And that's a very interesting juxtaposition to his worldview, which I thought was really interesting. Now, as he's lining up this shot, he does recite his mantra to us. Now, this mantra is really important, so I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here to cover this. This is his mantra. Stick to the plan. Anticipate, don't improvise. Trust no one. Never yield an advantage. Fight only the battle you're paid to fight. Forbid empathy. Empathy is weakness. Weakness is vulnerability. Each and every step of the way, ask yourself, what's in it for me? This is what it takes, what you must commit yourself to if you want to succeed. We're going to come back to this mantra several times. It's really important to understanding the character of the killer. He lines up his shot, he fires his shot, and he hits the prostitute, not the target. After all of these platitudes about what it takes to succeed and how important it is that and how great he is at his job, he actually fails. He botches the assassination. He does not kill the target. And then he goes into this frantic getaway. He has to get away. He has to do that in such a way that no one follows him. He takes off on a scooter. He ditches his weapons and clothes. He calls Hodges and tells Hodges what happened. And then he gets on a flight to the Dominican Republic. Now, it should be noted that when he's getting on the flight to the Dominican Republic, he sees this guy, and he kind of is paranoid about that guy and thinks that guy might be after him. We never learn whether or not the guy was after him, but what we do learn is that he spends the night, overnight, in a motel room instead of getting on a direct flight to the Dominican, and because he doesn't want to be on the plane with that guy. So he goes to the Dominican the next day, and that'll be important in a minute here to playing out what the plot is. But that's essentially Act 1, is him revealing his worldview to us, revealing his mantra to us, revealing the code of ethics, which is not much. It's kind of like do whatever you want, his code of ethics. But his way of behaving in the world is revealed to us, and then he botches the job. So all of that, when he leaves for the Dominican Republic, that's the beginning of Act 2. So all of that was just Act 1. Plot point 1, from a structure perspective, is an impactful event that happens at the beginning of Act 1. And that, of course, is him botching the job by him shooting the prostitute instead of shooting the target. That was the plot point 1. It sets the story in a new direction. It's not something that he's experienced before because he's been successful his entire career. And so this is a new thing for him. And then we're going along on this journey with him. The most important part of Act 1 is him revealing his character to us. So let's take a look at that character really quickly. As the film opens, the killer seems arrogant, calculated, and basically apathetic to whatever impact his actions will have on the lives of those around him. He's very much, we kind of covered all of that. By the end of Act 1, he has started to change a little bit. He remains arrogant and calculated, and he's still very OCD, but he's becoming a little paranoid, and we're seeing the first stages of doubt start to take hold of his personality. And I found that really, really, really interesting. So that's Act 1. Again, I know that was a lot, but we had to unpack all of that so that we can get into Act 2. Now we transition into Chapter 2, which is the beginning of Act 2 from a structure perspective. And the killer has traveled to the Dominican Republic, as I said, and the chapter is actually titled The Hideout. So the killer, arrives in the Dominican Republic and takes a Jeep across country to a really remote mansion. And when he gets there, he realizes that someone else has been there recently. He sees fresh footprints at the mansion's gate. Now, we probably already have surmised that the hideout is his mansion, but that's what's going to be shown to us as being true in a minute here. He draws his gun, he goes inside, and he finds an absolute mess. Somebody has already been there. They got there before him, and that prompts him to head straight to the hospital, where we learn that he has a girlfriend who was assaulted by two people who were looking for him, looking for the killer. But of course, she was there, and they questioned her, tried to get information out of her, and assaulted her in the process. Now, it's critical to note here that this is the first time in the film. We're already 35 minutes in. This is the first time in the film where we've seen an emotional reaction from the killer. He clearly cares about his girlfriend and was worried about her well-being. That's a very interesting thing coming from him, who hasn't revealed any of his feelings to us thus far. And so we're seeing a completely different side of him now that he is in a very new place. He goes to the hospital. His girlfriend's brother, Marcus, tells him that a man and woman came by the house looking for him. They're the ones who assaulted the killer's girlfriend. And Marcus doesn't really have any information on them except that they left in a green taxi. Now, the killer, in a conversation with Marcus, his girlfriend's brother, says something very interesting. Marcus, I promise, I swear to you, nothing like this will ever be allowed to happen again. Really interesting statement. One of the things that I think is interesting about the killer's worldview, as he articulates it, the world is what it is, so you should make yourself the god of the world, in other words. And notice what he says here. Marcus, I promise, I swear to you, nothing like this will ever be allowed to happen again. Now, for a guy who doesn't believe in God or spirituality or spiritual perspectives, what he's basically saying is, I'm not going to let this happen again because I'm going to take the place of God and I'm not going to allow this. The killer stays by his girlfriend's side until she wakes up. Again, kind of a new side. We see him showing some sort of empathy or sympathy for her. And then he also pays for her to be transferred to a private hospital in Punta Cana, which, if you're familiar with the Dominican Republic, Punta Cana is the resort city where all the rich tourists go in the Dominican Republic. Now, when the killer's girlfriend wakes up, she says she couldn't bear never seeing him again. That's a very interesting thing to say, because if we think of him only as a robot assassin, she clearly loves him, right? She couldn't bear not seeing him again. So to me, the fact that they seem to love one another immediately calls into question the reliability of the killer's narration to us in Act 1. So we're going to break that down as we keep going. So the killer goes to scour the city looking for green taxi cabs. He breaks into a taxi cab office, finds the work order for the drive that the taxi cab driver took somebody from the airport to his place, because he's trying to find these two people who assaulted his girlfriend. And then he covers up his tracks by making it look like someone robbed the taxi cab dispatch office. Now, before he hunts down the actual taxi driver, he stops by FedEx to send a package that requires a signature upon receipt. And he sends that package to Hodges, the guy he was talking to on the phone in Act 1, who is his handler, who deals with the contracts about the assassinations that he's doing. From there, from FedEx, he goes to hunt down the taxi driver. And as he's doing this, he's repeating his mantra to us again. Stick to the plan, anticipate, don't improvise, trust no one, never yield an advantage, Fight only the battle you are paid to fight. Forbid empathy. Empathy is weakness. Weakness is vulnerability. Each and every step of the way, ask yourself, what's in it for me? This is what it takes. This is what you must commit yourself to if you want to succeed. Now, a quick note here. Notice how he's already breaking part of his mantra. How? Well, he's trusting his girlfriend and he's trusting her brother, Marcus. He says not to trust anyone, but he's definitely trusting them. He's also begun fighting a battle that he's not being paid to fight. He's going after these people who assaulted his girlfriend, but he's not being paid for this activity. This is not an assassination that Hodges gave him that he'll earn money from. So now his definition of success is even changing a little bit. And it's just really, really, really subtle. At this point in the story, we might be wondering if this cold-hearted, psychopathic assassin has actually begun to show some empathy. Think of it this way. If he's not doing this for money, why is he doing it? Is it just self-protection, or is there something else going on here? And how does that relate to his worldview overall? Now, he finds the taxi driver who's named Leo, and he gets a description of the two assassins who drove to his home and assaulted his girlfriend. Leo describes a woman as looking like a Q-tip, and then he describes the guy as someone who should be kept on a leash. After getting those brief descriptions, the killer shoots Leo in the back of the head. And then he heads to the airport and gets on a flight to New Orleans. After he boards the plane and heads to New Orleans, that basically ends chapter 2, which is the first fourth of Act 2 from a structure perspective. And we start chapter 3, New Orleans, the lawyer. But before we jump into that chapter, let's talk about what we learned from chapter 2. So the killer's failure in Paris means that people are after him, a man and a woman. We know that his worldview doesn't seem as solid and unwavering as we were led to believe in Act 1. He has a girlfriend in the Dominican Republic who he seems to have feelings for. That's a little bit surprising to me. And he's also starting to break his own code. Even as he repeats his mantra to us, he's not even abiding by his own mantra as he's doing this. He also sent a FedEx package requiring a signature to Hodges in New Orleans, which will become very important in a minute here as I explain that. And finally, I think we're starting to see a new emotion from the killer as he changes on this character arc that he's on. We see a new emotion, and that's anger. We didn't see that before. He was cold and calculating and arrogant, but he was always still in control. Now he seems like he's getting a little bit more angry. He's still paranoid as well. But we don't know exactly why he's feeling these things, and he's not expressing these to us. We're having to observe them in him. Why is he going about hunting down the people who assaulted his girlfriend? Is this a cold-blooded, calculated, practical response, or is this a response motivated by anger, fear, and the desire for revenge? Because it's certainly not motivated for any monetary reasons. He's not getting paid to hunt these people down. Now, this second portion of Act 2 is labeled Chapter 3, New Orleans, the Lawyer. And in his narration, he tells us that Professor Hodges encouraged him to stop studying law and start skirting it. And the way he delivers this line makes me think that he sees Hodges as a mentor of some kind, not just a contract manager for his business of assassination. I feel like he sees him as maybe like a mentor as well. He goes and buys a trash can and a few other items so that he can break into the law office by posing as a recycling employee. Now note that this plan, how to get into Hodges' office, which has a whole door that he couldn't get in by himself, this whole plan has been in his head for a while. How do we know that it's been in his head for a while? Because he sent the FedEx package like yesterday or the day before. So he's now following the FedEx package. He's the one that sent the package. And he knew I'm going to get into Hodges' office by sending a FedEx package that requires a signature. So when the FedEx guy goes in, I'll be able to break in as well into Hodges' office. This is all part of a plan that he has. He makes his way into the law office. He confronts Hodges and then Dolores, who is Hodges' administrative assistant. And the most interesting part of this scene, to me, revolves around the relationship between Hodges and the killer. Hodges seems confused and frustrated by the killer's visit. He can't imagine why the killer would come to see him. Why is that interesting to me? Well, because to me, Hodges is essentially saying to the killer, you're breaking your own code, maybe even the code that Hodges taught him. Why are you breaking the rules of engagement that I taught to you as your mentor? Hodges even goes on to say, surely you can't be angry with me. It's as if Hodges himself believes that anger is a useless emotion. Did the killer, here's the question, did the killer get his nihilistic philosophy on life from Hodges? I kind of think he might have. Now, in Hodges' mind, the killer shouldn't be there at all. The killer should be off somewhere starting a new life. That would be the reasonable, logical thing to do. Don't worry about a girlfriend. Don't worry about your hideout. You've been around the world. You have plenty of money. Just go live a new life. But the killer isn't doing the reasonable, logical thing. At least it doesn't seem like it. And that makes his character even more fascinating. Now, Hodges keeps trying to reason with the killer by applying reason and logic to this situation. It feels to me like Hodges has been manipulating the killer for years, preaching to him about how nothing matters and that he's just a cold-hearted, money-making robot whose job is to assassinate people. But from the killer's perspective, it seems like that's actually breaking down, and maybe he's not just a cold-hearted, machine robot killer. Now, the killer does shoot Hodges with a staple gun and then watches him drown in his own blood. He repeats his mantra again, but now it makes even less sense. One, he's definitely not getting paid for this particular fight, and he's about to end up showing some empathy for Dolores. Yes, he does kill Dolores, but he also makes a deal with her. Now, we might argue that, well, he has an excuse not to kill her because she can get him some of the information that he needs to find other people that he wants to kill. But I do believe that he is actually taking a little bit, he's having a little bit of empathy for her. To that point, he kills her at her home on the stairs and makes it look like she fell down the stairs and broke her neck, as opposed to just shooting her and making it obvious that she was involved in an illegal assassination operation under Hodges. Meaning that, to me, he's showing empathy by the one thing she wants from him is, please don't make it look like I'm part of this whole thing, even though she is. And he kind of says, okay, I'll have some sympathy on you, and I'll make it look like you're not part of this whole thing. So I do believe that there's just a touch, just a little tiny bit of empathy there. Now, Dolores does show him the information that he needs, both on the lady who looks like a Q-tip and the man who was with her. And she gives him bonus information. She gives him the information on who hired him to do the assassination in Paris in the first place, the one that he botched. And by the time we reach this point of the film, by the time he kills Dolores and he has the information on these next three people that he's going to go after, we have reached the midpoint of the film. Hodges has been killed, Dolores is dead, and the killer has the information that he wants so he can go off and kill, or at least confront, the other people that he's about to look for. So what did we learn from this middle portion of Act 2 that took us through the midpoint? Well, one, it's starting to feel more and more like this is all about revenge, which is definitely not what the killer's stated worldview in his code would have been about in Act 1. So this is new territory for us. Two, Hodges likely influenced the killer's worldview and code and may have literally served as a mentor and potentially a manipulator of the killer to turn him into a robot, maybe even have groomed him into an assassin. Except that people aren't robots, and the killer's humanity has literally ruined everything about that perspective thus far. And we're going to go into that even more as the story continues. And finally, three, from a plot perspective, the killer now has the names and addresses of the assassins who came after him for botching the Paris job, and he has the name of the guy who ordered the Paris job hit in the first place. So now we're entering the third portion of Act 2. And this part of the film, in my opinion, is the weakest part of the film, but it does have a brutal fight that's very intense. So if you like that kind of thing, then this is your section of the film to be excited. The man who assaulted the killer's girlfriend isn't with the Q-tip lady anymore. They're in separate locations. And this guy, who's referred to as the Brute, he's in Florida, and he lives in basically a little backwoods compound. So the killer identifies the Brute because he sees that the Brute has a leg injury. Leo, the cab driver in the Dominican Republic, told him that the guy had a leg injury, so now he's associating the two, and he goes, this is the brute, this is the guy that I'm going to kill. Look, my dog's excited about this part of the movie. The killer then drugs the brute's guard dog and then enters his house and kills him. And that's a much longer scene because there's lots of stuff going on there. But that's essentially what happens. The killer just drugs the guard dog. He walks into the house. There's a giant fight, but he ends up killing the brute. After the fight, the killer starts to recite his mantra all over again, except this time, it's a super abbreviated version, which I think reveals something extremely important here. So let's see how it's abbreviated. He cuts it down to, this is what it takes, what you must commit yourself to if you want to succeed. Simple. As if his actions have just been justified by the code, except that he left out a bunch of the parts of the code that he's already been breaking. So he's still clinging to this worldview and to this code because it seems to be very inherent in his character, even though his emotions seem to be overriding that code. I would even argue that the shortened version of his mantra now feels like something he's trying to convince himself of. He's trying to convince himself that he's a robot. But really, is he? Can he still be a nihilist with how much emotion and intent he's putting into this pursuit? He wants revenge because something was done to him, was something done to people who he loved. And that's what's causing him to do these things, not because he needs money or because he's just going about the job that he has. This is not about money. It's about something else, and it feels like he's doing it for revenge. And if that's true, if he needs revenge, is nihilism actually something that he can still believe in? Interesting question. Now, this whole chapter ends with a very crucial reveal. The guy who told us that nothing matters and that it's not a big deal to be an assassin, that it's just a job, that people live and die, that his actions don't account for anything significant in the bigger scheme of things. That guy, the killer, is now passionately pursuing the people who assaulted his girlfriend. In other words, it's no longer about the job, it's definitely not about the money, and it's most certainly about revenge, which runs counter to what he's trying to tell himself is true. Every time the killer kills someone, his worldview crumbles just a little more. And the only two people left on his list are the Q-tip woman and the person who hired the hit in Paris that he botched. So the killer gets on a plane and heads for New York, which brings us to Chapter 5, New York, the Expert. Now, the first thing of note here as we enter Chapter 5, which is called the Expert, that's kind of important in my opinion. What's really fascinating to me is the narration coming from the killer as he's trying to hunt down the expert, the Q-tip lady. The narration is about how she has made extremely odd choices. He thinks she lives too close to the city, and he questions why she would want to live in the suburbs. To him, that's odd. It feels wrong. He wouldn't do that. And yet, she's labeled as the expert. That's the name of this chapter. And I find that dichotomy really interesting. The killer thinks that he's the expert. He told us how great he was at the beginning of the film, and yet she's labeled as the expert, and he doesn't understand why she's doing what she's doing. And that's really interesting to me. Now, he follows the expert, who, by the way, is played by Tilda Swinton, phenomenal actress. He follows her to a very ritzy restaurant. Now, he almost shoots her at a stoplight on the way to the restaurant, but he doesn't. And I think that may be a key scene because the killer seems to think that she doesn't know that he's following her. But I think she does know. And we'll talk about why in a minute. Now, she's eating dinner and having a drink by herself when he enters the restaurant to confront her. She orders a flight of whiskeys and her own bottle of whiskey from the waiter. The conversation between the expert and the killer, which is mostly just her talking and him listening, is fascinating for many reasons. And it's mostly about the expert reflecting on her career. So let's dive into that a little bit. First of all, the expert hopes that Hodges died horribly. And my take is because the way she says it makes me feel like Hodges was a master manipulator who manipulated not only the killer, but also the expert, Tilda Swinton's character, into being an assassin. And she sort of hates him for it. That's sort of what Hodge did to the killer. I think it's what he did to her as well. And I find that really interesting. I am reading into that a little bit, but it feels that way to me. The main difference here, though, between the killer and the expert is that the killer doesn't seem as awakened to that reality as the expert is. The killer's intense focus on destroying any form of emotion has prevented him from seeing the truth of how awful all of this is, this enterprise of assassinations. But the expert has already reflected on it seems like, and knows that what she's doing is awful. So he seems like he's maybe stunted in that area, but she's had more time to think about it and consider it, and it bugs her to a certain degree. Now, she tells him that it would be impolite for him not to join her in her Last Supper, and then when he doesn't respond, she says, "Afraid it's tainted." Now, the waiter delivers the whiskey flight in the bottle that she requested, and the expert positions the whiskey intentionally and begins to drink from each taster. That's important detail. We'll come back to that in a minute. The expert goes on to share a little bit about her career, wondering how she could have done all the things that she's done. She's reflecting on all the assassinations that she's committed. Notice that this level of self-reflection from the expert is kind of completely absent from the killer at this point. We don't really see him reflecting in that kind of way. The expert also tells him a story about a hunter and a bear. The purpose of that story, I think, is for her to convey what she's learned. She thought that being an assassin was all about the money, kind of like how he has told us he thinks about being an assassin. But ultimately, I think she realizes that being an assassin for her was about something else. She made it about the money, but maybe it was actually about having significance, being important, having power. She doesn't say what it was, but the point is, it feels like the expert realizes that she's been deceiving herself for her entire career and that it wasn't about the money, it was about something else. And she sees that the killer is kind of going about his life in the same way that she used to. Now, I'm reading a lot into that. There's a lot of subtext there, but that's what I believe is happening in that conversation. And I find that incredibly fascinating and great from a writing perspective. The biggest takeaway here is the juxtaposition from the killer to the expert and the two characters combined. The expert knows that Hodges manipulated her. She hates him for it. But she also realizes that she had a part to play and was deceiving herself the whole time. She convinced herself that her actions didn't matter. She convinced herself that what mattered was doing the job and making the money. But what she's suggesting now, reflecting back and telling the story about the hunter and the bear, is that none of that was true. She became an assassin for other reasons, probably because she wanted to feel special. And then we see the killer sitting across from her, finally starting to realize that maybe she's right and Hodges was wrong. It isn't just about the job. People's lives aren't just fodder for him to make money. Maybe it was never about the code and the money being the correct philosophical approach to life. Maybe that was just a manipulation from Hodges to turn him into a robot assassin. I love this aspect of the film, and I think it's presented with the perfect level of subtlety and subtext. There's so much happening here, but it's all in the background. It's not just being force-fed to us. It's really, really fantastic. It's probably a great film to study for subtext. Even though we're getting a narration from the lead character, there's so much more subtext that makes this thing incredibly fascinating. So now, having finished the whiskey tasters, she pours herself some whiskey from her bottle. The killer takes that whiskey and gulps it down. And that moment is critical, but we'll come back to that. For now, just know that the killer drinking the whiskey from her glass is plot point 2. The killer then escorts the expert out of the restaurant and they head toward the river so he can kill her. As they walk, he starts to recite his mantra, but she interrupts him. She tells him that in his final moments, when he's going to die, he'll think of her. And then he shoots her and he finishes reciting his mantra. The next thing we see, the killer's on a plane heading out to confront the guy who put the hit on the Paris target. And he tells us, risky, this one. He knows that going to see the billionaire who hired the hit will draw all kinds of attention. When you go after a billionaire, billionaires tend to have a lot of influence, and you're going to attract a lot of attention by doing that. But his response to thinking about that isn't reciting his mantra. He doesn't recite his mantra for success, which he does all these other times. What does he do instead? He says, fuck it. He's going to go do it regardless. So what does that mean? He's completely off the rails of what his former code was. His code? Fuck it. Nihilism? Fuck it. All his convictions have been crumbling, and he must keep going. And that brings us to Chapter 6, Chicago, the client. The killer arrives in Chicago to hunt down the client. Now, the client is the person who hired the killer to try and take out the target. So this is the whole botched job. The person who set it all up is called the client. The killer breaks into a super upscale gym that the client uses so that he can clone the client's home key card. And then he heads to the bank and withdraws all his money. So he's basically trying to get out of this whole life, and the client is maybe the last thing that he addresses. But here's what's fascinating about this whole next sequence of events, about how he gets to the client. It all feels incredibly improvised. His mantra says never to improvise, but he's literally improvising now. All the elements of his mantra, from trusting no one to not improvising and making sure it's part of the plan, all of these things feel like they're completely out of alignment with what his mantra actually is. He steals a fob from a janitor. He buys a gun off a street vendor. This is a guy who's like immaculate with how he does these things. He even leaves an Amazon box in a public trash can. None of these actions showcases a sophisticated plan, as we've seen from him in the past. What he's doing goes against everything he has previously stood for. So this character development and this character arc is incredibly compelling. But again, very subtle. As the killer heads up to the client's expensive apartment, he's thinking back through all the conversations he's had in exacting his revenge, on this revenge journey that he's been on. And I think the reason he's visiting the client relates back to his arrogance in the beginning of the film. The killer wants to blame the client for his own failure. There's a part of the killer who wants to blame this guy for even having the hit placed in the first place. The killer wants to blame the client for his life falling apart and his worldview falling apart. And I find that very, very interesting. He still hasn't taken the responsibility of his actions onto himself. Not like the expert seemed like she was starting to get to. And so the difference between the killer and the expert is the expert had become more aware that she was responsible for her own choices. And the killer is still kind of figuring that out, and he's not quite there. And I find that really, really interesting. So the killer confronts the client. And what's interesting here is that the killer just wants the client to tell him that there's no ill will between them. And that's insane, because the killer from the beginning of the film would just have shot the guy. He wouldn't have had this conversation and had sympathy for him or empathy for him or anything. He just would have gone up to the guy and shot him. He would have never have left him alive. But rather than kill the client, the killer just gives him a warning. He says that if he has to come back, he'll kill him. And the really important line here, when he's talking about how he might kill the client, he says he might kill him by maybe a radioactive speck on the lip of your favorite coffee mug. A slow death, mind you, from painful facial necrosis. And then the killer leaves. Now, why didn't the killer murder the client? Because he's thrown his code, his old mantra, and his worldview out the door. It no longer means anything to him anymore. And that brings us to the epilogue, which takes place back in the Dominican Republic. Now, the first shot we get is a close-up of a coffee cup, which we were just talking about a coffee cup. Interesting. Now, he takes that coffee cup to his girlfriend, who's on the deck of their amazing place in the Dominican Republic. And the killer narrates, "The need to feel secure. It's a slippery slope. Fate is a placebo. The only life path, the one behind you. If, in the brief time we're all given, you can't accept this, well, maybe you're not one of the few. Maybe you're just like me, one of the many." So to me, this suggests that his former worldview has collapsed. There's still a hint of it being there, but a lot of it has collapsed, and now he's just one of us. He's not special. He's not as great as he talked about himself being as in the beginning of the film. He's kind of getting used to not being special, if you will. But here's what's fascinating to me. As he sits back in his chair, you got to watch this really closely. As he's sitting back in his chair, what happens? His face twitches. What a great ending. Now, there are two ways to read this ending, and I'll tell you my preferred way of viewing it, which I think is right. I think that the way that I prefer to read it is the one that's intended. But just so we lay this out in two different options. Option number one, you could see it as the client wanting to make sure that the killer dies, because that's a dangerous person to have out in the world, right? So you could assume that the client actually hired another assassin to leave a radioactive speck on the killer's coffee mug. But I don't think that's actually what the film is suggesting happened. I think what the film is actually suggesting happened is much more diabolical and way better. I think the expert planted a radioactive speck on the tasters back in New York. And when he took a drink from her taster, he sealed his own fate. What's the evidence for this? Well, one, I think that the expression on her face reveals it. When she sees him drink the shot. I think that her dialogue about remembering her on his deathbed also reveals that, because she knows that when he starts to get the facial necrosis, he's going to realize, like, oh, she did it to me. And technically, we never see the killer drink from the coffee cup that he gives to his girlfriend. He doesn't drink from that particular coffee mug, which makes me think that that's just used as a point of connection to have us remember that he talked about the radioactive speck on a coffee cup. They showed the coffee cup to make us remember that. But really, the radioactive speck came from the expert, who had a whole protocol for what she would do if someone came after her, especially if she was going to die herself. She's like, well, I'm going to take you with me. And she left a radioactive speck on the taster, and he took it, and now he's going to die a slow, painful death like he threatened the client. Really, really, really well written, really well paced, fantastic film. Now, in the end, as much as the killer might like to think that he escaped his old life, he hasn't. There are still consequences for his actions. And that's probably the last lesson that the expert has taught him. He's going to die a slow, painful death from facial necrosis because of the way he chose to live his life. The premise of The Killer, in my opinion, is nihilism destroys itself and those who adhere to it. And I think that is a fantastic premise. But what did you think of The Killer? Did I miss any of the details? Did I miss any of the little idiosyncrasies that you could have seen from him and the things that he was doing? Did I miss anything from his character development? Which ending do you think is more accurate? Leave me a comment down below and let me know. It is my second favorite film of 2023, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.